Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is How Do We Measure Innovation? The economic analysis of the impact of M&A on innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. The Biden administration's antitrust enforcement policy has given greater weight to the notion that competition incentivizes innovation. In 2023, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission jointly released revised merger guidelines, and among some of the notable revisions, these guidelines indicate that when analyzing the competitive effects of a proposed transaction, the agencies may attempt to define and assess harm to a relevant innovation market, that is, a market that includes products that would result from innovation if successful, even if those products do not yet exist, and the potential loss of innovation. Today, we'll be speaking with an economist about the challenges posed by trying to measure the impact of mergers on innovation, with a particular focus on the pharmaceutical industry. My co-host today is Lijun Zhang. Hi, Lijun.
Hi, Alicia. I look forward to our discussion today.
Me too. Would you like to introduce our guest and kick off the conversation?
Our guest today is economist Penka Kovacheva, a vice president and co-lead of the life sciences practice at Cornerstone Research, where she specializes in litigation and regulatory matters. Based in Los Angeles, Penka leads a large team in performing complex economic and statistical analysis on a range of issues within the life sciences and healthcare industries. On the topic of today's episode, she and her colleagues recently published an article in Concurrences entitled The Impact of Pharmaceutical M&A on Innovation, Insights from the Literature and Gaps Remaining. It's a great read if you're interested in learning more about this topic. Penka, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So people seem to have different views about the relationship between antitrust enforcement and innovation. On the one hand, it is intuitive to say competition tends to drive innovation. On the other hand, it is not a novel argument to say antitrust enforcers should show some restraints in certain industries that feature sophisticated innovation. In the merger context, there has also been lasting debates as to whether and how collaboration or even consolidation can sometimes invigorate innovation, but other times chill it. So we talk about innovation a lot, but what exactly do we mean by innovation and how exactly should we think about it? I understand there's relatively few legal authorities shedding light on how innovation or loss of innovation is supposed to be defined, measured, or weighed. So I wanted to ask you, Penka, how economists have been approaching this question.
Those are several very good questions in there. Let me start by explaining first what innovation means in the pharmaceutical space. It is a complex process and it can mean many different things. Most commonly, people think of innovation, pharmaceutical innovation, being the process of bringing a new drug, a new vaccine to the market. But it can also mean innovations in the manufacturing process that can make it cheaper, faster to bring those drugs to market. Or it could really mean finding a new use for a drug. Pharmaceutical companies typically continuously innovate. Even after they bring a drug to a market for a given population, later on they may discover a new use of that drug. And so innovation in terms of coming up with new diseases that can be treated with the same drug or new patients who can benefit from that drug is also considered innovation. And it is this complexity that I think is causing trouble to both economists as well as federal agencies in thinking about innovation and potential impacts on it.
I understand you and your colleagues at Cornerstone Research undertook a project on this topic that led to a paper recently published on concurrences, especially for innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. Can you share with us a little bit about that project?
Yes, of course. So we started with this question as we were just discussing that innovation in the pharmaceutical industry is very difficult to measure. It's a complex process. And so we were intrigued by this. And we also wanted to study this question because it is very important within this industry. The pharmaceutical industry is one characterized by quite a lot of innovation. It is also one characterized by quite a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And so we thought it's the perfect place to study this effect. How do mergers and acquisitions in the pharmaceutical space affect innovation?
So I understand for that paper, you and your colleagues did a very thorough literature review in the field. And how do you envision it to be useful? And how do you envision it to provide insights in the relevant discourse?
So we wanted to start with a literature review first because we were aware of some papers who had already studied this question, studied the question of how do mergers and acquisitions between pharmaceutical companies, how do they affect the innovation and the coming up with new drugs in the marketplace. We were aware of some, but we had not really done a systematic review. And so we really wanted to understand, is there an economic consensus out there about what is the impact? And what we did in our review, we were interested in studying this question from both theory as well as from a data or empirical perspective. We wanted to understand if theoretical economists, have identified all the mechanisms through which mergers and acquisitions can affect pharmaceutical innovation. And then we wanted to see whether empirical economists have measured that impact and have a sense of its size and its importance.
And so can you give us the high-level view of what your findings were and the result of this survey of the literature?
So the theoretical literature on this question is actually quite rich. That's what we found. There are quite a number of papers who have identified a very wide range of mechanisms through which pharmaceutical M&A activity can affect innovation. On the other hand, what we also found is that the empirical literature is a little bit lagging. There are fewer studies that can actually measure the impact, fewer studies that try to detect which of these various theoretical mechanisms are more important than others and can really speak to what is the overall impact. There is few studies and their results were rather mixed.
Kind of relating to what you just said about the lagging in empirical analysis or studies, is there any way to objectively measure innovation? When we talk about innovation, are we talking about numbers of patents, or are we talking about expenditure in research and development, or whatever other proxies? Is there any real consensus as to what's the best measurement for innovation?
This is a very good question. It's also a very hard one. Our literature review shows that economists have been grappling with this question and have tried to measure innovation in a variety of ways. Some of them are exactly what you said. Economists have used expenditures in research and development activities, numbers of drug patents, numbers of drug applications to the Food and Drug Administration as various ways of measuring innovation. Each of these measures, however, have limitations. All of these I just mentioned, typically we think of them as innovation inputs. They are measuring how much effort we put into innovation, the intensity of it. But they don't necessarily get at the output of the innovation. They don't get at how many drugs get put into the marketplace. And they don't necessarily get into the question of the quality of innovation, if you will. What is the consumer welfare impact of those new drugs? Do consumers use them after they get released relative to older medications who may already be on the market? And so we really, as economists, we like to think of pharmaceutical innovation being something that impact consumer welfare, and that's what we are trying to measure. But it's really difficult, and that is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, I think the empirical results we see in the studies that are already out there are rather mixed, because they use a variety of measures and are getting at different things more often than not, inputs rather than these more meaningful outputs that we are really trying to get at.
Now let's take a look at the other aspect of this competitive analysis and in putting innovation into the mix as a factor. We just assume, antitrust economics assumes that more competition drives more innovation, which is beneficial from a consumer welfare standpoint. It also assumes that less competition is going to result in the harmful effect of loss of innovation. Did any of the studies that you reviewed actually show that a merger and a reduction in competition somehow enhanced innovation?
So you're completely right that there are studies that look at this question. There are studies that show that mergers and acquisitions, by reducing competition, can harm innovation. There are studies that show that, for example, if two big companies merge, if that merger leads to increase of their market position, they may have less of an incentive to come up with a new drug in order to maintain that market position or to enhance it. However, we think, and the literature demonstrates it, can be somewhat a simplistic way of thinking about it. There are also other studies that show that mergers and acquisitions in the pharmaceutical space in particular can actually have quite a lot of innovation enhancing effects. For example, mergers between a big pharmaceutical company and a small biotech company can have quite beneficial effects in terms of improving the small company's access to funding for research and development activities, can stimulate knowledge sharing, and therefore can actually help come up with more innovation and with bringing new drugs to the market. There are quite a few studies that do actually test this hypothesis and demonstrate that indeed such mergers lead to more drugs on the market, leads to higher likelihood of a drug going through the very long process that is required to bring a new medicine on the marketplace.
To hop on that topic a bit more, when a big pharmaceutical company acquires a small potential competitor with some breakthrough innovation, does that raise the concern that the big pharmaceutical company is also killing future competition?
Yes, there's actually a paper that has studied this question of whether, exactly as you say, the idea is that the motivation for the merger could be to remove a potential competitor down the line. If you will, kill the drug candidates in development so that they never make it to the market. That was one of the papers we reviewed, and there are, we think, some potential questions and issues with actually the findings of that paper that we highlight in our literature review.
It sounds like there are both pro-competitive and anti-competitive effects when we talk about merger and acquisition and innovation. I guess the natural next question is how we balance the two sides. Have you reviewed any studies that suggests how potential anti-competitive harms to innovation should be weighed against the potential pro-competitive effects?
So this is another good question. Unfortunately, I don't think we found a good empirical study that does this. I think one of the limitations of the empirical literature is that usually due to data constraints, the papers focus on just one of these many mechanisms we talked about. And so they don't really, the papers that we found in the literature can't really tease out the many ways through which innovation can be stimulated and the potential ways in which it could be harmed in order to come up with an aggregate measure. This is something that my colleagues and I are hoping to do with a subsequent paper, but it is still work in progress.
Clever listeners will realize that we've now walked through pretty much the whole rule of reason. We've talked about the questions surrounding innovation in defining a relevant market, the causation of anti-competitive effects, and then ultimately this balancing test of weighing pro-competitive effects against anti-competitive effects. The next question we're going to ask, obviously, is how do you think we should be engaging in this kind of an exercise?
Yes, so this is definitely a very good question, and I do think it's key to coming up with a good answer. If you don't measure innovation well, it's hard to say what the impact on it will be. And we talked a little bit about some of the challenges. Really, main challenges is to capture innovation, not just in terms of inputs, but also looking at outputs, to have a way to capture whether the innovation in the pharmaceutical space is bringing new drugs to the market and whether these drugs enhance consumer welfare. That really is at the heart of it. But being able to do that depends on having a very long series of data, very rich and very long series of data, because the other characteristics of innovation in the pharmaceutical space is that it is a very long process. And so if you only look at a few years after a merger, you will not capture the full impact, potential impact of that merger. It takes over a decade to bring a new drug to the market. And so it is really key to be able to have this long-term perspective in order to really assess the impacts of mergers and acquisitions. And the other aspect of this process that we think is key in order to come up with a good measure is to really think carefully about this idea of a market, if you will, or this idea of what the potential therapeutic space is of a drug candidate that is being researched, let's say, by a small biotech company that may be subject to the acquisition. Pharmaceutical innovation is not only long, as I explained, and complex, it's also very nonlinear. Sometimes pharmaceutical companies start with an idea of how a compound can be used and research it in a particular therapeutic space. But it turns out that they afterwards, years after the fact, discover a very different use for that drug that may end up being much more important. And so this nonlinearity, the fact that it's very difficult to predict a drug very early in development, how it will end up being used by consumers, this creates a lot of problems in, again, measuring innovation, but in also thinking about the incentives of two companies to merge, and then thinking about these potential negative impacts that some people have identified.
So that analysis seems to get very nuanced very quickly. So I guess a related question is who would be best positioned to identify the benefits and harms and balance them? I assume to do that job would demand deep expertise in the field in dispute, or otherwise how can one predict with confidence how innovation will unfold in that particular field down the road? The question is, in practice, will a generalist judge be capable of balancing the harms and the benefits, and to what extent experts are helpful in helping the judges with that analysis?
Well, this may be a little self-serving of an answer, but I do think that economists are key in helping judges understand this question. It is very complex. As we just discussed, it requires analysis of very rich data. But economists are well equipped, and as our literature review indicated, there are a lot of theories out there that really can be put to the test with good data. And I think economists are very well positioned to do that.
Well, thank you, Penka. Thank you, Lijun. That was a very interesting conversation. We're going to have to start the end of the show now. And before we let you go, we're going to ask you a few things we like to ask many of our guests. And the first question we have is, what advice you have for young economists looking to do what you do?
Well, I would advise them to really take a look at the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's a very interesting industry. It has a lot of very interesting questions, as we were just discussing. And I think coming up with good data and being able to answer it in that particular industry is a promise for a very rewarding and very interesting career.
All right. Well, that sounds like good advice. Now, listeners won't know this, but throughout this entire interview, Penka's had a big smile on her face. I think she really enjoys doing this stuff. So take that advice from somebody who's obviously enjoying what she's doing. The other question we'd like to know is, tell us something interesting about yourself that is completely outside of your professional life.
Sure. So I really love swimming. I'm an avid swimmer, and I've done it since I was very little, even competitively, before kids and job intervened. But I moved to the Los Angeles area, as Lijun mentioned, 8 years ago, and I've discovered that swimming in the Pacific Ocean is a very different animal than what I've been used to. Very warm, nice, controlled swimming pools. So it's something that I've been struggling with to get to know and get to experience and enjoy open water swimming in the Pacific. So it's a challenge that I'm trying to engage more with outside my work.
And that's such a pleasant challenge.
Yeah, good hobby. Now, for the final segment, we're going to play a little game we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
The rules of the game could not be more simple. Lijun's going to draw a random surprise question out of our virtual hat. So take it away, Lijun.
If you were offered a free seat on the next space shuttle, would you accept it or not? And why?
Oh, I will definitely accept it. I like a good challenge, and I am fascinated by space. I would love to take that if anyone were to offer it to me.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what use an economist might be up in space, but maybe there's some experiments you can run. Who knows? Maybe when we get a colony on Mars, you can help create the regulatory infrastructure of Martian politics or something like that.
That would be interesting, yes.
Thank you, Penka. Great answer. And thank you, Lijun. Thank you to our listeners. And tune in for next week's Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.